Well, good morning, everyone. Our government was elected on a commitment to investigate the existence of well-funded foreign special interest groups that had been waging a decade-long campaign to landlock Alberta's oil and gas resources. I'm pleased to report that we have officially fulfilled that commitment. I'd like to thank Commissioner Steve Allan for the hard work and due diligence that went into the inquiry and for submitting a comprehensive final report. That report, along with the Deloitte report, is now available on the Government of Alberta website. Those reports together provide extensive evidence of sophisticated and well-financed campaigns, such as the tar sands campaign, that specifically targeted the development of our resources. There have been many suspicions and theories about those campaigns over the years. During my 13 years' experience working in the energy sector, I personally saw the evidence of these campaigns as they targeted pipelines like Northern Gateway Pipeline, Line 9, Energy East, KXL, and Trans Mountain. I could see the antics and tactics of these campaigns on the ground. I could see these campaigns as they stacked regulatory proceedings, organized grassroots activities, litigated when things didn't go their way, targeted policymakers, discredited regulators, and even chained themselves to infrastructure. What the public inquiry report does is to document with a significant level of detail who was involved and what their motives were. The organizations involved in these campaigns celebrated their successes as each pipeline project was delayed or cancelled. While they boasted, Albertans were hurt. People lost their jobs, businesses went under, families were hurt, government revenues from royalties were impacted. We lost billions of dollars in royalties. We saw pipeline bottlenecks, and that led to heavy discounts and led to curtailment. While other jurisdictions were able to build infrastructure, we have been deliberately blocked. Albertans have a right to be upset. And while there is justification to be upset, I truly believe that sunlight is sometimes the best disinfectant, and this report does exactly that. It shines a blinding light on the broader movement and the vast amount of foreign funding that is crossing the Canadian border, often untraced. These organizations operated like a business. The Commissioner called it an industry unto itself. They applied for and received funding and grants from multi-billion-dollar foreign foundations. That foreign funding was used to not only target pipelines and projects, but to influence domestic public policy, legislation, and regulatory processes. That should concern all Canadians. We are not talking about small money here. The amounts involved are profoundly large. From 2010 to 2018, approximately $15 billion of foreign funding directed towards Canadian charities came across the border. Foreign funding of Canadian-based environmental initiatives was at $1.28 billion between 2003 and 2019. Many of these organizations operate as an industry, adapting to emerging markets and trends, and jumping from cause to cause. And that money comes across the border with a lack of transparency and disclosure. The funds are hard to find and difficult to trace. It's like tossing a penny into a muddy pond and trying to find it. The deeper it sinks, the more murky it gets and the harder it is to find. That's why the Commissioner's #1 recommendation is for better transparency and governance. For over a decade, these campaigns targeted our energy sector, and it waged on, from protests to blockades, to lawsuits and celebrity arrests, and even dangling from the Iron Workers Memorial Bridge. The goal was always to landlock Alberta's oil and gas. That was the ultimate goal of the tar sands campaign. We saw it play out step by step, and it continues today. Divestment campaigns operating today have claimed to achieve over 1,000 divestments from fossil fuels, representing $8 trillion. Recently, we saw President Joe Biden continue his pleas for more OPEC oil in order to rescue the United States from high fuel prices. If only Canada could have provided Americans with a stable source of energy from a trusted friend and ally that adheres to the highest ESG standards. If only we could have avoided this energy crisis. To be clear, Americans are looking for someone to blame for today's skyrocketing energy prices. I know a few organizations named in this report that they could thank for that. Imagine if the Northern Gateway pipeline had not been vetoed in 2016. It would have been delivering 525,000 barrels a day of oil to overseas markets. Markets that are experiencing an energy crisis and are stockpiling crude that we can't deliver because infrastructure was blocked. The world is in an energy crisis with a shortage of supply of oil and natural gas. Alberta could have helped. Let me repeat that. Alberta could have helped, but we have been blocked because of these campaigns. Instead, other oil-producing jurisdictions like Saudi Arabia and Russia have been given a strategic advantage. They are able to ramp up production and use that wealth to fund their energy future, whether that is hydrogen, renewables, or clean natural gas. It is a transfer of wealth with zero impact on reducing global GHG emissions. It doesn't make sense, and it clearly doesn't achieve the outcomes those campaigns claim to stand for, such as reducing emissions and protecting the environment. But we can't change the past. We can't change how we got here today. But we can learn from the observations of this inquiry. We have to focus on the future. We have to learn from the very well-executed strategies that these campaigns employed so effectively. We have to learn from that so we can protect the energy resources of the future. Now knowing how these campaigns operate, we can predict that these kinds of campaigns are coming after the next thing, whether that's hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, critical and rare earth minerals, small modular reactors, or LNG. It's money looking for a cause. We need to ensure that we do not frustrate or delay the development of energy resources of the future. The things that are needed here in Alberta to reduce emissions and set Alberta up to diversify and be competitive in a world that is moving to lower carbon emissions. Our government remains committed to the best interests of Albertans and protecting and supporting the Alberta's energy sector. I'm pleased to say that we accept the Commissioner's recommendations and already are acting on many of them. This includes demonstrating national leadership in emerging low-carbon resources development, enabling Indigenous participation in responsible energy development through the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, and things like the Site Rehabilitation Program. And earlier this year, we established an ESG Secretariat, which is set to help attract capital to Alberta by sharing a positive, unified, and compelling narrative that showcases Alberta's ESG performance and ambitions. The bottom line is that Alberta's natural resources belong to Albertans, and decisions about their development should be made by people of this province, and we are committed to ensuring that that occurs. At this time, I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, so we will take questions from the floor to start, and then we will rotate between the floor and the phones. Each reporter will have one question and one follow-up. So to start, we'll start with Tom Vernon from Global.
Hi, Minister. Thanks for taking my question. Just going through this, I mean, the revelation that environmental organizations were campaigning against Alberta infrastructure projects, I mean, you named a few examples of what they were doing. These were very public examples. Was anything nefarious? Did this report find anything nefarious?
Well, the report itself didn't suggest that anything illegal was going on. We weren't asking them to look into whether there were illegal things happening. But what we do know, and if you ask people in Alberta who lost their job if they think anything wrong happened, I'm pretty sure they would say yes. People were hurt, they lost their jobs, they lost their savings, their families were impacted, the province was impacted, the income that we need in this province to pay for essential services were impacted. So was it illegal? No. Was it wrong? I think the majority of Albertans would say it was wrong, and they want to know how it happened, who was involved, and how they can make sure it doesn't happen to the energy resources of the future.
Looking at the recommendations, better engagement with First Nations, better tracking of greenhouse gas emissions, better development, encouraging development of low carbon solutions. I mean, aren't these the sorts of things that we've been hearing from these environmental organizations to begin with?
Well, I think what we can learn from the report is, and understand from their strategy, is how successfully they deployed it and implemented, and how much they collaborated together to work together in a common interest. On the other hand, what the report found is pro-resource proponents operate in silos. They often work as if they're competing with one another. We have to change that. We have to learn from their tactics on the need to work together and to not work in silos if we want to ensure that these types of campaigns don't impact us as we try to develop hydrogen. Imagine where they would go, where they are going with hydrogen. They labeled the oil sands as dirty oil, as tar sands. They're now going after hydrogen, and blue hydrogen made from natural gas. They're going to call that dirty hydrogen. We can't ever let that happen in Alberta.
Okay, and we'll take a question from the phones.
Thank you. The first question is from David Staples, Edmonton Journal. Please go ahead.
From 2003 to 2019, they identified more than $1 billion of foreign funding related to Canadian initiatives on environmental causes, but they had pinpointed, I think, about $54 million on oil sands only. I think some people might have been hoping for more, like to get. So we have the number now between $1 billion and $54 million for the anti-Alberta energy campaign. Was it a failure to not get more precise numbers on that, to not actually come up with a final number? Here's how much it was, because we're kind of left between the two numbers.
Sure. Well, you know what? The numbers were confusing to me as well. I read through the report 3 times, the entire report, and I would encourage everyone to read through the whole report, plus the Deloitte report. And I understand some of those numbers are confusing because I had to write them down and try to understand them. But I also understand the difficulty that the Commissioner and Deloitte's had in tracing those funds. And what this does is it highlights the need for their first recommendation, which was for greater transparency, greater disclosure, and greater accountability. And you know what? These groups could change that today. Today, they could actually release their records. They could disclose where they get the funds and what they're using them for. They require that from public corporations to disclose climate risk and ESG initiatives. They could follow their own advice and do it themselves. But you're right, those numbers are confusing. There's big numbers. I mentioned in my speaking notes, there's big numbers. It's $15 billion across the border targeting charities. Now, of course, some of that is going to be benign, and it's truly for charities. Then he found there was $1.28 billion went to target environmental initiatives. That's when he gets into wordsmithing and tracing the documents and the funding grants using computer searches and words. That's where it gets complicated. But in that, he found a significant hundreds of millions of dollars targeted towards marine planning. Well, guess what marine planning is? That's what led to a tanker ban. That's what vetoed and killed Northern Gateway. It was marine planning. There's hundreds of millions of dollars spent on conservation initiatives, creating things like the Great Bear Rainforest. Well, to my understanding, you can't build a pipeline through the Great Bear Rainforest. So all of those things ring-fenced Alberta and served to landlock it. So that's, again, mention that because of the difficulty of tracing those funds. But the fact is, it doesn't matter if you're somebody who lost your job and was hurt by it. You don't care if it was $100 million or $10 billion. You lost your job, you were harmed, Alberta was harmed. We need to learn from their tactics, and we need to move forward and make sure it doesn't happen to the next resources of the future.
Okay.
In terms of this being any nefarious activity, do you think that just in the general sense of that word, that the fact that he finds that this was an invisible campaign, that it was that was one of the goals of the campaign setting out the tar sands campaign to be invisible. Is that aspect of it, in your mind, was that nefarious on the part of the people organizing this effort?
I think if you go back to the original tar sands campaign document from 2008, it spells out the tactics, it spells out the playbook, all the characters and actors, how they would build on their strength, how there would be funding agencies, how they would utilize it. We see that, and we saw how the strategy played out. Those funds came across the border extremely difficult to trace. They moved to re-granting organizations who then re-granted out, and it shifts from charity to charity, from cause to cause, from litigator to activist, from communications to research. It's all over the place, and it's hard to trace. And I think that was the point of his recommendations around transparency and accountability. And we're going to follow those. We're going to do what we can to implement them. I think it's important. It's not important only for Alberta, but it's important for all Canadians, because that is money that's crossing the border. $15 billion, $2.5 billion, almost $2.5 billion in 2018. That's money looking for a cause. It's money that the Commissioner has proven and documented has been used to influence domestic policy, legislation, regulations, regulators, laws, regulatory process. Only Canadians should have a say in that, not foreign-funded foundations worth billions of dollars in other countries.
Thank you. We'll take a question from the floor.
Hi, Minister. It's Julia Wong, CBC News. You're throwing some pretty big numbers out, but really the report found it was $54 million in foreign funding that was put towards these anti-Alberta energy campaigns. The report itself cost $3.5 million. The province's own war room budget is around $30 million over 4 years. So was this whole endeavor a mistake?
The $3.5 million is money well spent. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the billions of dollars that has been crossing the border under the guise of charity and the untraceable aspect of it. And with respect to the $54 million, frankly, I'm surprised, and that's that any grant would blatantly say it's for an anti-Alberta energy campaign. I'm surprised that any money would cross the border being that blatant. The fact is, a lot of money crosses the border for other initiatives. The most likely was the obvious one was the marine planning, and that was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And specifically, I can point to one thing that was underway in around 2010, and it was the start of the tanker ban. It was called PNSEMA, the PNSEMA Initiative Ocean Planning. And guess what? There was money coming from the Moore Foundation, almost $10 million, to set up and pay for that domestic process, to do marine planning here in Canada. Now if that isn't anti-Alberta, if that isn't meant to stop the development of the oil sands, there nothing is. The way to cut that off was a tanker ban, and that's what they got, and it was paid for and funded out of these foreign foundations in the United States. That should make Albertans outraged. I know it makes me outraged, because again I go back and say, where would we have been today if the Northern Gateway pipeline had been built? We'd be supplying energy to the world in a global energy crisis. Instead, now it's Russia and Saudi Arabia and other countries that are doing that. But worse, those countries will take the wealth from doing that, and they will use it to fund their energy future. They will use it to get a strategic advantage over Albertans and Canadians to get ahead on hydrogen, carbon capture, technology and innovation. We've been put at a competitive disadvantage because of these foreign-funded campaigns, and I'm not okay with it, and I don't think Albertans are okay with that.
Minister, I can't help but notice that you're standing here alone without the Premier, without Steve Allan. You've had this report for several months. I'm sure the schedules could have been arranged for everyone to be here. This was the Premier's campaign promise. Why is he hiding?
I don't believe the Premier is hiding. There's a lot of initiatives underway in the province today, and a lot of important initiatives. This is something that he's known has been near and dear to my heart. I've spent practically my whole lifetime studying this and understanding this. I lived through it when I worked in the energy sector. I've stayed close to it every single day as the campaign's going through. Commissioner Allan, well, he's completed the report. His work is done. He's letting his report stand. It's 650 pages, thoroughly researched documentation. He's letting that stand. It's an excellent report, and I think it should be required reading for Albertans. I would encourage everyone to read every single page of that report.
Thank you. We'll take a question from the phone.
Thank you. Graham Thompson, iPolitics.
Yes, Minister, just to go over a question you've been asked, I think, several times now, but just to get it clear in my mind, I'm quoting here from the Allan report saying that he has not found any suggestions of wrongdoing on the part of any individual or organization. No individual or organization, in his view, has done anything illegal. Indeed, they have exercised their rights of free speech. But you've spent 2 years, $3.5 million investigating people and organizations who were simply exercising the rights of free speech, according to Allan. So was it worth it in a sense? I know you're saying it was wrong, maybe not illegal, but you spent all this time and money investigating people who were doing legal activities, exercising the rights of free speech.
Well, look, the report was never meant to be something that would censure or impugn or punish. It was never meant to be finding whether something was illegal or not. Frankly, I don't care if the activity is legal or illegal. It doesn't impact or detract from the fact that Albertans were hurt. People lost their jobs, people lost their homes, their investment, their income. The province has been set back at a competitive disadvantage. The fact that it's whether it was legal or not was not part of the terms of reference. We didn't ask him to find that, and frankly, it doesn't matter. I think the report speaks for itself. And again, if you wanted to ask an Albertan who lost their job, an Albertan who was going to have a job working on a pipeline, working on an energy project, working in one of our oil and gas companies, or a laborer that would have a good paying job, if it was wrong, that person, I'm pretty sure, would say it is wrong, and they'd be outraged.
Okay, to follow up, then what in this report would stop these individuals, organizations, from continuing to exercise their rights of free speech?
Look, I don't think there's any issue or concern with anybody exercising their right to free speech. And there's no doubt that many of these organizations and activists have genuine concerns for climate change and the environment. That's a given. But what's the problem here is the lack of transparency, the lack of disclosure of foreign funding coming across the border and what it's used for, where it came from. I think that's the problem. And I think the other issue here is it's not a matter of freedom of speech or expression. It's a matter of disclosure and transparency. And I think the other key thing is the report found that these groups operated as a business, an industry unto itself. Their job was collecting funds, collecting grants, using them for causes. And we know that this is now, it's money looking for a cause. It's going to come after the next thing. And we can't let that happen, because we need to be able to diversify in our province, to be able to build the energy resources of the future, whether it's hydrogen, carbon capture, small modular reactors, critical and rare earth minerals. We suspect and we predict they're coming after those things, and I think this report is extremely important to show what happened in the past and to use that to learn from it and prevent it from happening in the future. And the first thing, the first recommendation is one of the most important ones, because it asks for transparency and disclosure. As I said in my speech, those organizations could fix that today. They could post the sources of their funds. They could post what they use it for. They could disclose it tomorrow. just exactly like what they're asking public corporations to do, to disclose their ESG initiatives and climate risk. They could do that themselves, and that's what we're asking them to do.
Thanks. We'll take a question from the floor.
Hi, this is Audrey Neveu from French CBC. The report says that Commissioner Allan specifically can't parse out the effect of environmental campaigns hampering the oil industry from the impact of the general reduction in the demand for oil and gas. So how fair is it to blame environmentalists for the loss of jobs in the oil industry when we know that it is inherently a cycle of up and downs?
Well, I think, as you can see in the report, the Commissioner could not conclude that the campaigns were the sole cause of project cancellations, pipeline cancellations, pipeline vetoes, and I think he's documented that the estimate of those project cancellations was between $100 billion and $129 billion. He can't point in a public inquiry and quasi-judicial proceedings with a certainty of proof that those campaigns were the sole cause. We know that market factors are at play, but what we can't deny is those environmental organizations celebrated. They celebrated when all those projects were killed or vetoed or canceled, and they boasted that it was their work that canceled them, and people lost their jobs. And just in the last few days, as we see Quebec is banning the development of their natural resources. I saw this morning an environmental organization tweeting and taking credit for it, saying it took years of work to get to that point, years of work. And now, and they say we want other provinces to do the same as Quebec. We don't know if that organization receives foreign funding. The problem is there's not transparency. And the problem is it's less transparent today than it was 5 years ago because they know that we're onto them, that we're tracking it, we're tracing it, we're trying to understand where their money. They've become there's been less transparency. So those groups take credit for it, and I think all you have to do is take one look at what happened to Northern Gateway Pipeline. I saw that, I experienced it from day one as they stacked the regulatory proceedings with a mob the mic process. As they litigated when they didn't like the result, they had activists. I had a colleague that got molasses dumped on him to replicate an oil spill. These groups were real. They targeted, they celebrated it when the projects were canceled, and I'm pretty convinced that if they're not the sole cause, they're a pretty darn big cause of what happened to all our energy projects in Alberta.
As a follow-up, going forward, what plans does your government have to amend legislation to ensure that nonprofits disclose their funds, for example, or just amend legislation to reach the goals that you've stated just there? And how does that align with your government's stated goal of cutting red tape for organizations?
That's an excellent question. There's a lot of recommendations in there about amendments to the Societies Act, and there's work underway. We're taking a look at all those recommendations and comparing it to our legislation. So that work is underway. And you know what, if something were to be amended that added red tape to save billions of dollars for the province and to save the energy sources of the future, I think that's not something that people would be too offended about. Now, the other thing that's important there is not only legislation in Alberta, but federal legislation. For the most part, a lot of these disclosure requirements are in the federal legislation. So we're going to continue to advocate and to push the federal government for those types of disclosure laws. A number of work was underway previously under the previous Conservative government to amend that legislation. That work was stopped when the Trudeau government came in. And incidentally, when you look through that report and you want to start looking through the Deloitte report, you're going to find that the organizations that were found to have participated in the campaign, because the number of ENGO organizations in Canada, the federal government funding to those exact same organizations increased by something like 798% after 2015. So we're in a situation now where we have the federal government funding those organizations that are targeting Alberta energy projects, along with multi-billion-dollar foreign funding. That needs to be looked at, and that needs to be considered as well.
Thanks. We'll just take another question from the phone lines.
Thank you. Alex McQuaig, Western Producer.
Thanks for taking my call. We've been hearing from ranchers and farmers who are supportive of the oil and gas industry and are politically conservative, who are frustrated with the unilateral cutting of lease payments and the environmental impacts of oil and gas infrastructure on their land. This report talks about transparency and accountability for those opposing hydrocarbon extraction in the province. Do you support the same level of transparency and accountability for multinational corporations not living up to their contractual obligations affecting Alberta's ranchers and farmers, and how will you demonstrate that?
Sure. I spent a considerable amount of time over the summers talking to farmers and landowner groups. And as some of you know, I grew up in a rural area where there's gas development, and there's some of these old inactive wells there. And there's a landowner group that's out there that I spent considerable amount of time with trying to understand the situation. And it's absolutely unacceptable that if and when oil and gas companies aren't paying the full lease payment to farmers. Farmers have the wells, the infrastructure on their property. They've signed a contract for it. These oil and gas companies need to pay the surface right holders in full. And we're taking some steps to take a look at the Surface Rights Act to make sure it's being complied with, specifically Section 27 of that Act, and how these energy companies are dealing with the ranchers. It's a problem. I'm aware of it. We're addressing it.
Will you commit to launching an investigation into the costs associated with the impact of multinational oil and gas companies not living up to their obligations to those in the province, or for those in the province's agricultural sector?
We're actually regulating it. Under the AER, we have the authority and the regulations to require them to do things. We've taken steps inside the AER with our liability management framework to ensure that the timely cleanup of oil and gas wells, that there's a mandatory inventory reduction. And I'd like to point out there's very few oil and gas companies that aren't meeting up to their commitments. In fact, there's some that are exceeding it brilliantly. Just recently, I saw an ESG presentation by one oil and gas company that has a lot of inactive inventory, and they're committed to getting to zero by 2040. And by that, I mean to have all of their environmental liabilities, inactive and old oil and gas wells, completely cleaned up by 2040. That's going to require a significant amount of spend, but they're committed to do it. And I want to go out and start challenging all the oil and gas companies to meet that target and to meet that challenge. I think it's important. I think we've heard enough from Alberta ranchers and that this needs to be addressed.
Thanks. We'll take the last question from the floor.
Catherine Grukowski with Alberta Today. So you had described these environmental organizations as being well funded, but at the same time, 54 million compared to the multiple billions in PR, it seems like it's more of a David and Goliath story. At the same time, I'm looking through this report, and it says the Canadian Energy Centre, the attempt to tell Alberta's story, it is, quote, it may well be that the reputation of this entity is damaged beyond repair. It says that the Crown Corporation is seriously compromised by having provincial cabinet ministers sit on the board. So how has this fight back strategy actually helped? It looks like there's a lot of harm. And second question, how will you be changing tactics as a result of the findings in this report?
Okay, I guess there's a lot of questions there. The first one goes back to the confusing numbers and trying to understand. And as I said, yes, they are confusing. A great deal of time needs to be spent to understand it. But that number of 54 million does not even touch the tip of the iceberg of the funds that were coming in. That was funds and money that was specifically worded, blatantly worded to be targeting Alberta's oil and gas development. Hundreds of millions of dollars came in and across the border to target marine planning, conservation initiatives, public relations, and it addresses these concerns about the difficulty tracing and tracking the money address the number one recommendation from the report, that we need accountability, transparency, we need disclosure. And so I think that attracts it. With respect to the Canadian Energy Centre, well, it's transitioned now beyond its early days when there was a lot of concerns raised, and it's been doing some really good research and advocacy as of late. It's published a number of very detailed, good, significant research, and their latest campaign in New York City has reached over 12 million people. That's the campaign to talk about friendly energy, Canadian energy, cleaner, closer, committed to net zero. The Canadian Energy Centre is aligned with ESG initiatives to get that message out, and we'll continue to work with it to make sure it builds upon these recent successes. And I think one of the things that we can take away from the report, I think your third question was about what we can do with those findings, is to learn from their tactics. What the report said is that the environmental organizations were collaborative. They worked extremely close with each other. They understood their strengths and weaknesses. They understood who did best, and they collaborated. Whereas the pro-resource, whether it's industry associations, think tanks, companies, they worked in silos, and they often competed. Well, that's the remaining. Many of the remaining recommendations in the Commissioner's report address that, and address how can we get the pro-energy groups to work more collaboratively. And I think there's a role in the Canadian Energy Centre to use their research and their research and their ability to have traditional ad campaigns and reach targets and markets in New York City, to work with those groups so that they all are deploying their best skills and they can work collaboratively. And I'm committed to doing more in that area and making sure that we can learn a little bit from the playbook of the Angos. They had executed their strategy brilliantly. We can do the same to protect our energy resources of the future.
Okay, we'll shift to the phones.
Tom Ross, 660 News.
Just trying to find my question here, sorry. I guess more on the Canadian Energy Centre. How can you still stand by it, though, when you know that it just hasn't been working to this point? And even the report itself, Steve Allan says that labeling the campaigns as anti-Alberta or anti-Albertan is not helpful or constructive. Why are you still referring to things as anti-Alberta?
Well, I think anti-Alberta was given a definition in the terms of reference for the Commissioner. It was given a very specific definition, and it meant campaigns that targeted, that were meant to frustrate or delay oil and gas resources here in Alberta. That's the definition of anti-Alberta. It's meant to target our number one industry and our resources. So I wouldn't get too overly excited about the word anti-Alberta. That can be a distraction, and we've learned and we're well aware of how some of these environmental organizations work to discredit things, and I think that's an area where this is happening. With the Canadian Energy Centre, as I said, it's long overcome some of its initial growing pains. It's changing, it's adapting to the new reality where ESG initiatives are more important than ever before. It's adapting to the reality of a world where energy sources, and the world is seeking energy sources with lower emissions. It's adapting to that, and it's using its strengths, which are in the research area, and ability to reach target markets like New York City with traditional ad campaigns. And that work will continue. And I think what we can learn from the findings of the report is that we need an organization like that more than ever, because we understand, we now know the sophistication of how some of these campaigns are operated. So we need to understand that and move forward. And I think the Canadian Energy Centre is adapting to those areas, and it's achieved quite a bit of success lately with some of its research and advocacy.
Did you have a follow-up?
we've lost our phone connection.
Okay. Well, let's, we've lost the phone connection? Okay. Do we have anybody else on the line? Okay. We'll just hold for a sec.
You gotta love technology.
Are we
Here.
okay?
Thank you. The line is reconnected. Please continue. Tom, you're still in queue.
Perfect. I got my follow-up.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. And then on misinformation, the key findings on the top of the report say that it proves misinformation. Back in 2019, when Jason Kenney announced the inquiry, he said that they were going to look at disinformation and propaganda. There's nothing in this report that proves misinformation, though. Is there anything you can point to around that?
Well, I think a question when you look at these studies through the context and the lens of a public inquiry is a quasi-judicial type of report where they have to follow rules of due process, evidentiary rules. To find whether something is a misrepresentation or a fact would require a very, very significant amount of work to prove something is true or false. You want to prove that even any minor fact on emissions data would have to go through a hearing to find whether it's misrepresented or true or false. That simply was not necessary in this case. We have a report that's extremely comprehensive that details the campaign in detail in 650 pages, and I think I would encourage people to read it for themselves and understand it, digest that information, and decide for themselves whether what happened and what was said and what was done was fair, because it hurt a lot of Albertans, and I think they have a right to be outraged.
Okay. Next caller.
Thank you. Aaron Collins, CBC.
For taking my question. The first recommendation from this inquiry is to increase transparency. You're asking environmental NGOs to disclose, how they're spending their money here in Alberta, and you say, like you said a couple times, they could do that today. So I'm wondering, are you going to begin disclosing how the Energy War Room, the Canadian Energy Centre, is spending its money? You could do that today.
Yes, and we do it every day. It's subject to Auditor General reports. Every penny, every dollar it spends is disclosed. Every dollar it receives comes from government grants. There's no lack of transparency there. And in fact, every single piece of work they do is examined meticulously for what it is. So there is full transparency there. So it's done. Check mark.
All right. Okay. I also want to just follow up real quick on Graham's question. When you boil it down, this report, I know this wasn't the intention of it or the direction of it. It found that these NGOs, these activists, they didn't do anything wrong. They're just exercising their democratic right to oppose these projects. So I just want to be clear here. Are you against them doing that? Would you like people to stop doing that?
No, I think it's important in a democracy that people are able to exercise their views. But and I know that a number of these campaigns had honest concerns about climate change and environmental initiatives. However, what the report found was a coordinated campaign that ultimately targeted influencing political and regulatory change using foreign funding. Foreign funding going after domestic processes and domestic policy, and that's the real concern. Those multi-billion-dollar foundations in the United States aren't concerned with the day-to-day lives of Albertans who are just trying to get by. They're not concerned with the revenue that the province of Alberta receives from royalties, revenue that's needed to pay for critical and essential social services. Those foreign foundations are not concerned with that. They're in the business of giving out grants, in a similar way to how a university gives out scholarships. That's what needs to be looked at is the funding, not the activity. Canadians have opposed opposed projects and concerns with environmental concerns for decades, for hundreds of years, and they have a right to do that. What we're talking about here is foreign funding of those interests.
We'll take one more question. We'll take two more questions from the phone, and then we'll wrap it up.
James Keller, Globe and Mail.
Hi there. I've got a question back to the numbers. There's this 925 million figure for environmental NGOs that you've referenced, and this is in the government's response to this as well. Almost half of that is from, or two rather, Ducks Unlimited. The majority of that money is to groups that Steve Allan identifies as not being participants in anti-energy campaigns. The same thing goes with the federal grants. The majority of the money detailed here are going to groups that he's very clear are not part of this. So I'm just wondering, why are those included? Is that inflating the scope of this foreign funding issue if most of the money identified here are going to groups that really have nothing to do with what we're talking about?
Well, I think a lot of the money that was identified in the report went to organizations that participated in the campaign, and particularly the federal government funding. Just take a look at how much moved to Tides Canada after 2018, how much went to World Wildlife Fund after 2015, how much went to World Wildlife Fund after 2015 and the Pembina Institute. I think those are real numbers and real things that should be looked into. Again, getting back to the amounts of money, I think it just accentuates the need for transparency. And as I said earlier, it's like throwing a penny into a muddy pond. It's pretty hard to find, and the deeper it sinks, the harder it is to find it. It's murkier and muddier, and then it hits the mud on the bottom, and you can never find it. It's gone forever. So I think that's the things this report addresses.
I've got a follow-up. I mean, again, the report makes it clear that when it comes to this, whatever it's at 925 or 1.28 billion, more than half of the money that is being included in the top-line numbers have nothing to do, according to Steve Allan, with anti-energy campaigns. Again, almost half of the NGOs is to Ducks Unlimited. So I'm just wondering why that's all wrapped together, and are you inflating the numbers to make this seem like more than it is?
I think the numbers described in the report are enormously large. There's about $15 billion he traced coming across the border to charitable interests. As I said earlier, a lot of that's benign, but we don't know. We don't know. He traced 1.28 going to environmental initiatives and segmented it down to what it might be, knowing that he had trouble tracing, following the wording in the grants. And of that, he found significant funds going to marine initiatives and conservation initiatives, and some that he couldn't trace to blocking resource development, but it's noted nonetheless. And I think what it points to is the need for transparency to understand the money coming across. Because again, to go back to what I said previously, that money is being used to target domestic policy, domestic legislation, regulations, regulatory processes, and even the regulator itself. So that all Canadians should be concerned about this. This isn't just an Alberta issue. I think other governments should be concerned with that level of money that's crossing the border, and not in a transparent way. I think that needs to be disclosed, and we need greater accountability and governance of these organizations.
And the final question from the phones.
Thank you. Ian Austin, New York Times.
Go ahead.
Hi.
Ian.
The $925 million, I'm a little puzzled. You talk about transparency a lot, but it looks like the inquiry came up with that number by doing something that any Canadian or anyone in the world can do, going to the Canada Revenue Agency charity site and adding up the numbers. So what exactly more transparency do you want? I mean, we know these groups appear at regulatory hearings, for example. Did you want, like, some law that they have to report specific Alberta things? And if that's what you want, should publicly traded energy companies and energy groups also be required to report what they spend on legal fees at regulatory hearings, what they spend on lobbying, advertising, and so on?
And they mostly do. It's called audited
They do not
financial
break those
statements.
numbers out in their report.
It's called audited financial statements, and those energy companies and publicly traded corporations.
A broad category, but there won't be specific breakdowns like you seem to be calling for.
They're being asked to disclose climate risk and ESG considerations, and they are, and they're doing it because it's the right thing to do.
That's not lobbying. I'm talking about.
Sorry, you asked your question. Can she answer? Thank you.
The corporate disclose their climate risk and their ESG considerations because it's the right thing to do. It's not because there's a piece of legislation requiring it to do that. All we're asking is environmental organizations should disclose the sources of their funding when it's from another jurisdiction and what it's used for. And the important reason on that is it's foreign funding that's impacting domestic processes, legislation, regulation, projects. It's foreign money, and I think all Canadians should be concerned, and that's the difference in that. And it's a fairly simple thing that they could do tomorrow. They could disclose that tomorrow, and they should. They should disclose it because it's the right thing to do. And I'm pretty sure at any shareholders, annual general shareholders meeting of a corporate entity, somebody wanted to know and got up and asked how much is spent, they're going to get that answer.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. Are you saying that if Northern Gateway had been built, oil prices would not be increasing right now? And is the province of Alberta opposed to the current increase in oil prices?
If Northern Gateway had been built, it would have been able to ship 525,000 barrels a day of Alberta crude to the northwest coast of BC, where it could get on tanker and get world price. It could get world price, and it could go anywhere, and primarily it was destined to go to Asian markets, those same Asian markets who are stockpiling crude because there's a shortage of it. Supply has lagged demand as we're coming out of the COVID, as economies are recovering out of COVID. There's a shortage of supply, and Canada and Alberta is not able to do that, not able to supply it. We should have been able to. We could have been able to, but we were blocked. Instead, what we're seeing is other jurisdictions, competing jurisdictions that produce oil are able to supply and able to have a strategic advantage of supply during a world global energy crisis. And it's a shame. Alberta could have and should have been able to do that, and we aren't, and we have a right to be mad.
And on that note, that concludes this media event. Thank you.
Thank you.